Hi, so today what I wanted to talk to you about is yields and areas and prices and how it all correlates. So let's just start with, I guess, the definition of yield. Now, I'm looking at it from a property perspective, but if you look at it very generally, to produce or provide, when you look at it in property terms, essentially it is where your monthly rent is measured against the overall purchase price of the property. And then, let's have a look at the actual formula. So yield is, you take all the rent that you make in a year, so your gross annual rent, you divide it by the purchase price of the actual property, and then you times it by 100 to get a rental yield. So just to give you an example, if you are purchasing a property for £100,000 and you are achieving, let's say, £6,000 annual income, which is £500 a month rent, then your property will be yielding at 6%. So why is this formula important? Well, first of all, it gives you an idea of payback time and returns. So if you simply take your purchase price and you divide it by your annual rent, then you'll get an idea of how many years, if you are receiving that rent, it would take to equal the purchase price. So to give you an example, if you purchase something for £100,000 and you are receiving £500 per month in rent every single month, then in a year you will make £6,000 in rent. So it would take you about 17 years to get your £100,000 back. Now, for me, a more important calculation is ROCE, which is the return on capital employed, because what the yield doesn't take into account, it doesn't take into account that you're actually not spending £100,000 buying the property, because you're probably getting a mortgage, so you're spending a lot less than £100,000, presumably, if you're not buying in cash. And also it takes into, it doesn't take into account that you're not going to retain the whole £6,000 in rental income. You're going to have to pay maybe a management agent. You're going to have to pay for your mortgage costs. There are other things that are going to chip away at this £6,000. But what yield does give us, it gives us an idea of the types of percentage returns you should be expecting area to area on an actual property. So the question that I was actually asked was, if you go and look for higher price point properties, essentially, how does that affect the yield? And there's a couple of ways in which I kind of look at that question. So first, I guess we have to figure out what is the average yield in England. What I can tell you is that the average renter in the UK spends about 30% of their earnings on rent. And that's an important thing to consider when I explain the next bit. So first and foremost, let me just touch on where am I getting my data from. So I'm looking at Knight Frank, I'm looking at the FT as well. And what I've done, I've kind of, because you can't get literally up-to-date data because everything's kind of in hindsight. So all the reviews take place, over the last year. So, but I'm trying to look at things that are, within 6 months. So 28th of April, and there's lots of different reports. I've looked at Home Track as well. I've looked at this is Zoopla as well. I've also looked at certain mortgages like Aldermore, CBRE as well. Hamptons, which was quite insightful. And again, another Knight Frank report here as well. And again, I'm looking at kind of Q1 2021, but certainly within the last sorts of 6 months. I'm also looking at the ONS, and this was published 16th of June. And I mean, it's got lots and lots of stuff to go through. I mean, table after table of what's happening, the kind of mean and median rental figures, regional, how different things compare. So I mean, there's so much data to go through. And after all of this research, I guess the conclusion is that, looking at the average yield across England, I think it varies obviously area to area, but certainly you're looking at around sort of, anything from 3.5 to sort of 5%. Different reports get stats, and data from different sources. So it's not, entirely accurate all the time because everyone's reporting on their own stats and data. What I would say is that, once you understand that, Essentially, when you go to the higher price point of the market, so you start looking for opportunities that are higher in prices, what tends to happen is that the rents don't necessarily catch up and marry up to those prices. So your yield actually drops as a result. And what you have to understand as well, the only way you can then increase that yield on higher priced properties is simply by negotiating harder, try and bring that purchase price down. Because remember, the formula for yield is, the annual rent divided by the purchase price, right? So when you look at the formula here, the rent, you're not really going to change. The rental figure is the rental figure. And the property price, obviously there's some movement there. You can pay market value, or you can get it at a discounted price. You can get it below market value. So the lower price you get that property, it affects essentially this figure on the rental yield. But what's happening is in higher priced properties, you have to appreciate that most people, when they're looking at renting, there's only a certain amount that they want to pay, right? Because if you look at it from a different perspective, if they could buy their own properties, then perhaps that would be a route they go down, because they've got enough deposit and they earn enough per month to sustain this mortgage when they buy their property. But often renters can't get on the property ladder. So when you look at the higher priced properties, they don't necessarily lend themselves to the rental market, number one. And if they did, that person that owns that higher priced property would want to at least cover their mortgage, which essentially is going to be higher, probably because they borrowed more money. And then, the renters are going to have lots more options at cheaper prices, and therefore your yield is going to be affected. So long story short, I think this is why the North is performing really, really well. Because, if you look at the average price point per property versus the rents that those properties can attract, your natural yield in the North, is usually, if you look at some of the best performing areas, they're sort of 7% plus. Now, if you then get that property below market value as well, you're pushing that yield maybe to the 8%, maybe to the 9% mark in a sort of really, really sort of good investment scenario. But certainly, I would be saying that the higher the price of the property, generally speaking, the yield lowers itself. So I will do a follow-up video because I'm still reading some of these reports, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste as to what I found so far and just answer that question that, the higher price property that you go towards, does that, in effect attract a higher yield? And, by my calculations and research, no, it doesn't. I think there is almost like a point at which it starts to dramatically drop in terms of price point. So, I'm looking at sort of over the sort of 350, 400,000 pounds mark, you can see yields dramatically start to decrease. And that's partly because a lot of those properties, these 350, 400, 500,000 pounds properties, tend to be either in London, where, living costs are higher, and although wages are higher, the rentals are higher as well. So people, they struggle. There's affordability struggle there. And then if you're looking up north at spending, let's say 350 to 500,000 pounds, you're probably looking for quite an owner occupier, residential, emotional luxury buy, and that doesn't lend itself naturally to renting. Yeah. So hopefully, that kind of gives you an update as to where I am at the moment, but I will follow up, depending on comments, with another video explaining in a little bit more detail.